It's not enough to talk about potentials. We've listened to this story of Africa having bauxite, but that's not good enough. You're not going to eat all these resources. You've got to transform these resources. We've seen other countries, other regions of the world not having the kind of assets that we have, but they've transformed.
Policy is not about responding to the challenges today. That is first aid. Policy is about building the structures for the future.
We believe that we can do things differently because it's not all about crisis, it's also about opportunity.
We should not forget that really largest source of funding for Africa is actually already domestic resource mobilization. So Africa needs to increasingly rely on itself.
Hello and welcome to the Sustainable Africa series. I am Ernest Chijo. We're coming to you today from Gaborone in Botswana, where young researchers, economists and policymakers from across the continent of Africa have just wrapped up 3 days of intense deliberations and discussions on how to secure Africa's economic future amidst global uncertainty. In case you're wondering what challenges Africa as a continent is up against and why urgent action is needed, let's check out a few facts. Africa loses an estimated $90 billion annually to illicit financial flows, while hundreds of millions of people suffer in poverty. In 2022, nearly 282 million Africans were undernourished. That's about 20% of the population, marking an increase of 57 million people since the onset of COVID-19. Now, did you know that only 40% of Africa's population had access to the internet in 2023? In other words, 840 million people in Africa had no access at a time when connectivity drives nearly everything from education to healthcare and economic growth. Africa's external debt exceeded $1 trillion in 2023, with extremely high interest payments hindering development. About $1.3 trillion is now required annually to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals in Africa. Now, in the paradox of plenty, 600 million Africans still lack access to electricity, even though the continent holds 60% of the world's solar energy resources. That's a pretty grim picture of a continent often celebrated as having the largest share of world's natural resources. And that probably explains why President Duma Boko of Botswana made this very powerful call to action.
Make sure that this conference does not degenerate into merely a generous exchange of flattery, a failure to probe honestly the challenges that face us as a continent and the world, the responses that we've fashioned in the past, and an open acknowledgement of our foibles and failures that have resulted in us being stuck as a continent in situations where our people are subjected to the grinding indecencies of poverty. I hope at the end of this conference you'll have reignited the passion, but that you'll also have inspired us to more action geared at lifting our people from poverty and raising our continent to take its rightful place as a leader in the world, and not just an emerging frontier.
Taking action to lift our people out of poverty and transform the continent into a global powerhouse is indeed the overarching goal of this initiative. That initiative is the African Economic Conference, organized each year by the Economic Commission for Africa, the African Development Bank, and the United Nations Development Programme.
Collaboration and cooperation.
Norma Sefuma is an advisor on economic affairs in the office of the President of Botswana.
The conference comes at a critical juncture for the country. I think that the insights, the ideas from experts, from development partners, from some of the private sector that are here represented will also give us opinions and expertise in terms of how we can move forward as a country. We are also facing a lot of challenges, economic challenges, inequality, unemployment, particularly amongst the youth. And some of these ideas, the exchanges, not only in terms of designing the strategies and policies that we need, but also taking a step further to implementing, because that's where the cracks and that's where the tire hits the tarmac.
ECA's Executive Secretary Clave Gatete argued that the current global financial and economic systems are not designed to support Africa's growth.
We must urgently push for a global financial architecture that prioritizes SDG financing, climate adaptation, and equitable growth.
Mr. Gatete outlined a few of the measures he believes can help secure Africa's financial future. First, domestic resource mobilization through instruments such as blue bonds, green bonds, and sustainability-linked bonds can help build resilience and financial sovereignty. Second, it is crucial to fix Africa's tax-to-GDP ratio, which currently stands at 15.6%, well below the global average. Even small improvements here could generate billions in additional revenue. Building regional value chains in key sectors is essential. Success stories like Botswana's beef industry, Ethiopia's leather production, and the cocoa sectors in Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire should be replicated across the continent. De-risking investments through better governance and transparency will also attract sustainable funding and reduce dependency on foreign aid. Mr. Gatete described the African Continental Free Trade Area as the continent's crown jewel, stating that nations must fast-track its implementation. But
we must remember that we cannot have integration without the seamless movement of people, goods, and services.
as African countries grapple with liquidity issues and the high cost of borrowing, ECA's Sonia Esobmaji emphasized the need for more strategic debt management.
Why are we borrowing? We found out that sometimes it's not very productive. We borrow sometimes to reimburse, previous borrowings. We need to develop our local markets. External borrowing will always expose us to shocks. So my key message is 1, economy diversification. 2, we need to be fiscally responsible. 3, we need to have a better public debt management strategy. And 4th, and probably the most important, we need to develop our domestic capital markets.
UNDP's Raymond Gilpin pointed out that African nations and institutions are increasingly recognizing that collaboration is key, as working in silos limits their potential for growth.
Globally, we're seeing more protectionism. Markets are being more inward. They're thinking about themselves and their neighbors, not so much about the world or Africa. We're also seeing that countries are now focusing on bilateral deals and not multilateral assistance. So African countries are realizing that the days of bipolar, playing one side over the other, those days are numbered, and that now they have to find a way to work together, but also to build a sort of economic infrastructure that bodes well for the future. Because policy is not about responding to the challenges today. That is first aid. Policy is about building the structures for the future. A lot of African policy, unfortunately, well-intended, is based on guesswork. We think this will be a good thing. We think this will be a great project, but is it backed by the data?
Caroline Kende-Rupp is the Director of Strategy and Operational Policies at the African Development Bank. She shared the bank's strategy for sustainable growth in Africa.
The African Development Bank has just completed its 10-year strategy. Our vision is based on 4 words, and those 4 words are prosperous, inclusive, resilient, and integrated. So over the next 10 years, the bank is really going to focus on that direction, and its interventions will be around how can we ensure that we seize the opportunities around these 4 areas.
Could you give us some examples of what you'll be doing differently? Because some would argue that those sound like some of the kind of themes we've heard before.
So I think the landscape's totally different. Suddenly we find ourselves globally in a situation where there's many interlocking and accelerating crises that nobody anticipated. We know about climate, but climate is now interacting with these other really big crises like access to food, simple as that. Access to energy, we know that too, but now it's become really imperative. We have a debt crisis as well in Africa. We have insecurity, high unemployment. But I have to say that this strategy is built on optimism because of Africa's unique assets, of which we have this young, dynamic workforce. Entrepreneurship is admirable. We also have a lot of other assets like natural resources. huge energy potential, renewable energy potential as well. We're integrating and urbanizing. So these are the reasons why we believe that we can do things differently, because it's not all about crisis, it's also about opportunity.
Okay.
The African Economic Conference also provides a platform for young researchers to present their findings and engage with senior experts and policy makers.
It is a great opportunity for me. I believe that the African Economic Conference is a good place where we can share our research and also network with many researchers. This is also a good place where we can reflect on the best way we can help our continent achieve sustainable development goals.
This is my first time presenting an academic paper to a room full of experts and full of African policymakers. I definitely feel like I'm being seen, and what I'm doing, what I've been studying, can possibly make an impact in African development, which is something that I'm deeply passionate about.
This conference is a way for me to improve my skills and also to have exposure, because I used to talk with lots of people from UNDP, from ECA, and also from the IFTB. So I take this opportunity also to talk with also young researchers to have also knowledge on other topics. So, and also I really like all the session, all the side events. So I think it was very useful for me, and I will try to come again next year.
So I know nothing about sovereign credit rating before in Africa. And today and yesterday in the conference, they introduced a lot of material about that. And that enables me to understand the challenge of African country in terms of financing. And also that enables me to participate in future discussions and research about these topics for African countries.
For us, it's also a great opportunity to spot talent and think, how to perhaps integrate them in ECA going forward.
Zuzana Shidrowski is the Director for Macroeconomics and Governance at the Economic Commission for Africa.
Many African countries today are middle-income countries, so they will need to change their sources of growth. They will need to focus on human capital and innovation, and that again requires funding. But beyond funding, there are opportunities. So one of them, actually, in an increasingly fragmented world, while AFCFTA is progressing and definitely has a political momentum, is actually regional integration. And how can continent as a whole position itself in this newly divided world when it comes to trade, and how can also substitute, for some of the now missing links in trade. Another one is investment. So Africa needs to attract investment, but increasingly it should also be from within the continent. It's also African countries, including the one we are in, that are often investing abroad rather than, outside of the continent, rather than in the continent. So how can we increase the trust? Issue of illicit financial flows is major. Another issue is the international taxation and profit shifting that so far the multinational enterprises are capable of doing, and there is a global recognition. This needs to be recognized, but we should not forget that really largest source of funding for Africa is actually already domestic resource mobilization. So Africa needs to increasingly rely on itself, and then the ratio of revenues to GDP is still low and below potential. So there is a chance for Africa to gain additional resources there.
To help us understand the thinking behind the partnership among the three institutions that co-organize the African Economic Conference, let's turn to ECA's Said Adejomobi.
I think this is a very strategic partnership, and consciously too. We have the ECA, which is the intellectual hub, the think tank, the policy think tank of the continent. We have the African Development Bank, which is the financial hub of the continent. We also have the UNDP, which we can call a, on-the-ground development arm, because UNDP is present in every country. So we have the three coming together to connect. And UNDP in many cases work with governments on the ground, every country. So with this tripod, we think that we can collectively work together and drive the agenda in terms of socioeconomic policies and in terms of engaging our member states. It's not enough to talk about potentials. We've listened to this story of Africa having bauxite, but that's not good enough. You're not going to eat all these resources. You've got to transform these resources. You've got to create wealth out of them. We've seen other countries, other regions of the world not having the kind of assets we have, but they've transformed.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of the Sustainable Africa series. I am Ernest Chicho, wishing you God's blessings in abundance. Goodbye.